often hear this phrase, creative testing framework. And I'm gonna be honest, I don't know that anyone actually knows what this means in the context of paid social advertising, or no one has an agreed approach to it, rather. So first, let's all agree on that. I think that this idea of a framework to test your creatives comes from upper management, aka your boss, asking you, hey, how are you going to make decisions on which ad creatives to make next? Which is a good question to ask, but I also think it's really misleading to think that there needs to be some agreed approach on the best way to prioritize and test your creatives. So I hate to inform you that we're still figuring this shit out, and a lot of times my perspective on this is changing. So I think when we're thinking about this idea of a framework, what we really need to do is just take a step back and think about how we're going to prioritize which ad creatives we're going to make next, and how to build out a roadmap that actually makes sense. So with this lesson, I'm going to talk about how I think about a creative testing roadmap and how you can come to your own conclusions about how to prioritize what types of ad creatives to test next. So from my perspective, you need 3 things to build a creative testing framework. Number 1, you need platform budgets. So most of the time this is going to be Facebook ads or Meta, and increasingly TikTok or Google Ads. You need to have a set budget for each of those platforms, essentially. And number 2, based on your monthly budget or quarterly budget or whatever, you're also going to have a number of creative tests that you want to execute per week or per month. And also inside of those tests, how many variations you're gonna wanna make of those. So for every creative test you launch, is it just gonna be one creative? Is it gonna be 2 different variations executing in the same type of strategy, but maybe using different messaging, slightly different imagery? What is that gonna look like? And then number 4, the prioritization framework on how you're actually going to roadmap all of those creatives out. So let's first zoom in on platform budgets, right? So in reality, your budget is ultimately going to determine how much creative you can test at any given time. So here are some rough guidelines that I've seen to be true in my career. So if you have a monthly budget of $5,000 on Facebook ads or less, you're probably only going to be able to test 2 to 3 ad creatives per month, with like 2 variations for each test. If you're spending anywhere from $5K to $30K per month, that's more likely going to look like 3 to 4 tests per month, and then so on and so forth according to this chart. And again, you're really gonna have to think about the variations that you wanna test inside of each of these bigger tests. So when I say variation, I mean, okay, so if you're going to be launching a new ad set or a new test for every single test, how many ads are you actually gonna have there? And my perspective on this is, if you have a smaller budget, you're really only gonna wanna have 2 to 3 creatives tops. But if you're starting to operate on a 75, 100K or more budget, you can afford to test 4 to 5 variations of any given creative. Although for what it's worth, I'm generally recommending now to brands to focus on making the best possible individual creatives and think a lot less about, oh, how can I split test this image and split test this creative? Really just focus on making the best individual creative assets that you can. I find that those slightly bigger swings, as opposed to strict A/B testing, actually yields more learnings and better performance for brands. And essentially, once you've gone through this exercise, this budget is going to yield the number of creative tests you can run, as well as the number of variations you should be running in each of those tests. And next up, you should have a list of creative formats that you're wanting to test next, right? But how do you go about prioritizing what you want to test first? And if you should even be doing it all, this is often something I see a lot in-house, where there are multiple different voices weighing in on the ad creatives. So the way that I approach prioritizing which ad creatives to test first, it really depends on 2 things: performance and time. So number 1 should really be your guiding light for anything. What do you think has the most potential to perform and perform at scale? And then number 2, timing, right? So what's going to be the least amount of time to execute on that also has the best potential for performance? So if something's gonna take a short amount of time and have the highest opportunity for performance, you wanna go there. But if something is not likely to perform and it's gonna take forever to do, you probably shouldn't do it at all. These are the other things that you need to consider when trying to prioritize your creative. Number 1, low-hanging fruit. What are the easy opportunities that your brand or your client's brand has based on all the great research that you've done? And number 2, what are some really big gaps in everything that they've tested to date? So are there any formats or any big ideas that you've seen that they just haven't tested or executed on that you think have the potential to perform really well? Like if a brand has never done UGC content before, I generally jump in and I'm like, yeah, you should probably test this as soon as possible to get a quick read on it and see if it's even worth investing further down the line. And then the final thing, what big swings do you think that could actually have a massive impact on performance that you would need to execute? Those are like those advanced strategies that we talked about in a previous lesson. And let's take a step back. If you have a new pixel, or you're brand new to Facebook ads, or you haven't conducted that much creative testing in the past, my suggestion here is to begin rapid format testing. So go back to the lesson about the ad creatives you need to test first. You should simply test those first. Seriously, when I am working with a brand, I am literally going through each of those and making sure that they've tested all of those to make sure that nothing was left on the table. So when your boss asks, hey, what's our creative testing framework, especially if you're in the beginning stages, you can say something like this. First, we're going to conduct rapid format testing. Facebook has actually determined that the amount of time that someone takes to decide if they're going to watch your ad or not is about 1 second. So how the ad creative is actually formatted on that first second is a huge variable in determining if people are going to stay and engage with your ad creative or not. This is why we're going to suggest doing this type of rapid format testing first. Once we learn about what types of formats are attracting our best users, then we're going to double down on those formats and begin doing more regimented messaging style testing. And then we're going to start focusing on bigger swings. But if you've already done quite a bit of testing, then I want you to go back to this idea of performance versus time. Your framework needs to first be prioritized by what you think is going to perform the best. Literally write those down in a list one by one. Now look at that list and determine the amount of time it's actually going to take to execute and create that creative. Surely there are some that are going to take longer to make. What you should do is you should push those out a few weeks to give your teams more time to actually make that creative. However, some of those should be low-hanging fruit that you can execute on almost immediately. Push those to the front so that you can get those out the door quicker while you're working on more of those longer term projects in the background. And oftentimes what I've seen is that bigger swings will often take longer, like founders ads, for instance, especially if you're working around a founder's schedule or you're even scheduling more of those highly produced studio shoots. So this is my cue to think back to those more advanced strategies that we talked about. Think about what you can plan for more of a longer term, and think now more about what you can execute on in the meantime while you're building up and working on those bigger swings in the background. Now, I know this probably feels like a lot of theory. To be honest, it is a lot of theory, and it's just so unique to every individualized brand, which is why, I want to have more interactive and live sessions with you guys so that we can really determine, hey, what is actually the best framework for you personally. But I'm hoping that this lesson really showed you the tools on how you can determine, okay, here's the framework that I'm going to set forth for my specific brand and my specific interests. It's definitely not one size fits all, unfortunately. And if you have any other questions, please be sure to bring it up in the Facebook group. I'd love to help you out there. And maybe we can do a special call on it if all of you guys are interested. I would be really happy to do that. All right, I'll see you in the next lesson.